Resident Evil 4 Remake released earlier this year and has received outstanding reviews from pretty much everybody. With Metacritic ratings that are no lower than 91% for any given platform, it's safe to say that 2023's Resident Evil 4 is about the closest thing to a perfect remake you're ever going to get. In fact, we ardently believe that the Resident Evil 4 Remake is the best remake of all time. And here's why. Remakes, remasters, and reboots are risky business, and in cases where a title that's over a decade old are concerned, the dilemma becomes a little more intense. And that's because anyone working with the IP has to ensure that they do enough to please long-time fans while also appealing to the sensibilities of newer audiences that may have no actual experience with the game in question. To this end, you would think that a one-to-one remake of any game, just with updated visuals and perhaps some smoother gameplay, would be more than enough to satisfy long-standing fans and maybe even rope in some curious newcomers. But if it were that simple, then I would imagine that just about every remake that remained faithful to the original game would be highly successful. But that just isn't the case. What's important here is that we consider games in their original context, and that while they may be masterpieces in their own right, this is because they managed to harness the technology and mechanics available at the time to satisfy audiences that had very specific expectations at that time. In other words, the original Resident Evil 4 from 2005, while obviously a smash hit, may be considered close to perfect in relation to the time period in which it came into existence. But a lot has changed over the years, and technology has advanced, and so expectations have understandably shifted. The original Resident Evil 4 is now a classic game. Scary to think, I know, and can be enjoyed as is with consideration for its context, but up against many newer games, it would undoubtedly fall short on several fronts, and that's just inevitable. And just to be clear, I'm not bashing the original game, just making a statement of fact. And yes, you are entitled to prefer to the remake for whatever reason, and I suspect that many of you do, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The thing is, there's more than an 18-year gap between the original Resident Evil 4 and the remake, and I'm telling you now that if Capcom had done a one-to-one remake of Resident Evil 4, a few or even a lot of older fans would be pleased, but I believe the vast majority of people would have universally disliked it, or, at the very least, the game would have received a lot of harsher criticism. This may sound sacrilegious to you, but I would wager that almost all of us don't want one-to-one remakes, because then I would say why bother when you can just go and play the original game? I like to think about it in terms of music here. Many bands release remasters of their tracks and albums, and I think in almost every case I always go back to the original recordings. Why? Because it's just better since the production isn't super clean and all the levels aren't perfect. I like the music as it is, and super polished remasters tend to strip away the grit and imperfections that make the original mixes so damn unique and powerful. And this is exactly why it's called a remake and not a remaster. Maybe you don't care for semantics, but the differences in meaning are clear here. Remasters should be one-to-one, and remakes should be just that. Remakes. That means taking all the stuff that made the original game so unique and amazing, leaving behind stuff that is either dated or no longer relevant, and creating an overall better product for gamers to enjoy. I somehow feel like this is going to earn me some scorn from more than a few of you, but just keep what I said about context in mind before you crucify me outright. And let's think about it in terms of music again. If a band re-records some of their hits from yesteryear or releases a live album, it's more or less the same song, but it's now presented in a different context and at a different time. And to my mind, this works just fine in most cases. Maybe a solo will be different, or perhaps a background harmony will come through better and the bass will cut through a little more, and you can enjoy the song as it was originally intended, or something. Will everyone like this? Definitely not, but I would say the vast majority of people always find this kind of stuff endearing and even necessary, and with a game with the pedigree of the original Resident Evil 4, it was a remake that absolutely had to happen. So what made the original Resident Evil 4 so great? Plenty actually. First and foremost, it has Leon Kennedy as the protagonist, and I know how much all of you love him, and understandably so. Leon is a highly capable agent who is cool, calm, and collected, but he's also witty and flatly delivers some dryly hilarious one-liners that are on a par with Charlie Sheen in Hot Shots. This just makes him that little bit more relatable than other Resident Evil protagonists, and his outfit in Resident Evil 4 is iconic as hell. What's not to love about the guy? And that's just it. You strongly get the impression that all of Leon's fellow protagonists are madly in love with him, even if they have a funny way of showing it at times. But while Leon may be the best, it's the gameplay in the original Resident Evil 4 that really makes it so damn good. And that's because it was the first game in the franchise to feature an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective instead of fixed camera angles and stiff tank controls. In this way, the pacing of gameplay was more frenetic, and combat felt more intuitive and dynamic than previous installments. In addition, instead of just mindlessly blasting enemies with a barrage of gunfire, you can target certain limbs. For example, shooting a foot slows an enemy down while hitting them in the arm forces them to drop their weapon. Add some quick-time events and the ability to dodge enemy attacks, and you have yourself a gameplay loop that is fun, engaging, and in the case of Resident Evil 4, memorable. And let's not forget the story here either. I'll admit I love the plot of just about every Resident Evil game, but this is the first game in the franchise that takes place in Europe and features some fresh new enemies and a super creepy cult known as Los Illuminados. While the zombies in Resident Evil are awesome, something about the Las Plagas parasites are just that one step more messed up and terrifying, and seeing that Leon becomes infected with the parasite himself and has to find a cure, the stakes really are that much higher for him this time around. And in all honesty, the game taking place in rural Spain allowed the developers to double down on the horror elements and max out the gothic vibes. There's a village, a castle, and an island that you get to traverse and explore, so there's a range of different aesthetics and atmospheres that arise in Resident Evil 4. But for all its upsides, there are some things that make the original Resident Evil 4 not so great. First and foremost, Ashley's original design, while cute enough, was a little odd, especially in terms of her fashion choices. And even if you say her getup is fine for the time, I doubt it'll really float with today's audiences. But more than this, in the original game, Ashley is kind of annoying and whiny. And while this may be in character, it weighed on the nerves of more than just a few fans. And her in-game AR was pretty awful if we're being honest, which detracted from the experience more often than not. You might consider this a minor issue, but for other gamers it was bordering on a deal breaker, certainly for some segments of the game. Another criticism many fans have of the original Resident Evil 4 is that it simply isn't a Resident Evil game because it departs too much from the mechanics of the originals, but in particular, 2005's Resident Evil 4 feels more like an action horror game with arcade elements than a survival horror. In fact, some fans consider the original Resident Evil 4 to be pretty cheesy and feel like it's closer to a B-rate horror film than anything else. I have little doubt that some fans actually enjoyed this and probably found it refreshing, but it doesn't really surprise me that people who love the first 3 Resident Evil games don't like Resident Evil 4 one little bit. And again, that's a totally valid and understandable point of view. And this is exactly why the Resident Evil 4 remake is superior to the original in almost every way. All of the elements that made the original game great are still in the remake, but other than a graphical overhaul and some improvements to gameplay, many of the aspects that were lackluster in the original have been tweaked and updated. For starters, the Ashley in the remake is a little older, more suitably attired, and ostensibly less annoying, though I've seen some fans still complain about her AR, which is kind of surprising to me, but not so much that I don't believe it. Also, all that B-rate stuff is pretty much gone, and while Leon may still utter some sardonic one-liners, the overall tone and feel of Resident Evil 4 feels a lot more aligned to other entries in the series. Speaking of which, there are also stronger links to the events of Resident Evil 2, so at least the devs tried a little harder to better connect Resident Evil 4 with the previous game that Leon was in. It's also really great that Krauser's character is more developed in the remake and seems to have a stronger, more authentic connection with Leon than in the original. And the whole knife fight has to be one of the best boss fights in the entire Resident Evil franchise, and I know many of you totally agree with me. It really is a highlight of the remake and helps to place the game head and shoulders above the original. But while the remake is definitely an improvement, I will say that the voice actor for Ada did not do a good job here, and many fans of the original, as well as new fans who have compared her 2005 character with the one in the remake, vehemently agree. But while this is unfortunate, and even though Resident Evil 4 doesn't tick every single box perfectly, it's still an amazing remake with a somewhat reimagined storyline, amazing boss fights, killer combat, and pretty much better everything, new Ada notwithstanding. And the proof is in the pudding, guys. The Resident Evil 4 remake has some of the highest scores for a game, and almost certainly the highest score for the remake of a game in history. So for this reason, and the ones we just mentioned, we're proud to confidently declare that 2023's Resident Evil 4 is the best remake of all time. So that's all I have to say, guys. What do you think of this video? Do you agree that the Resident Evil 4 remake is the best one ever? Or is there a remake of a game that you think is even better? Be sure to let us know in the comments. Go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for daily gaming, VR, and tech content. From me and the crew here at Metasquad, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Later!